Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a few moments, but wanted to let you in the room and get settled for what a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So we'll be underway here just in a moment or two at the top of the hour. So welcome to our first International Year of the Woman Farmer feature. And we have two distinguished women with us today that are going to be filling us in a little bit more about the U.S. Census of Agriculture and what it can tell us about women farmers in the U.S. So we'll be underway shortly. Welcome to Annie's Project International Year of the Woman Farmer feature. I'm Doris Mold, and I am CEO of Annie's Project. We are thrilled to be here with you to celebrate and acknowledge the International Year of the Woman Farmer. And what better way to kick off our programming for the year than to have a program on what the U.S. Census of Agriculture tells us about women farmers in the United States. So we will be hearing from our two distinguished presenters in just a moment or two, but just wanted to share with you a little bit of additional information. Of course, you're going to learn this. We already know this, many of us, that in the United States, there are 1.2 million women producers, and that's 36% of all producers in the United States that are women. And we'll be learning a lot more about that. And as I was chatting with our presenters before the session began, this topic is near and dear to my heart. I served on the Agricultural Statistics Advisory Committee for 6 years and served on the expert panel that suggested the changes in the census so we could have a better accounting of women and the new and beginning producers. And so I was one of the people that was really thrilled when we saw that impressive jump in number of women farmers from 2012 to 2017 census, and that's continued strong into our 2022 census. So we'll learn more. Don't want to steal any more thunder away from our presenters. They have a lot of good data to share with us and good thoughts. But we're really excited at Annie's Project to be part of the International Year of the Woman Farmer programming. We're part of a larger group of organizations throughout the United States that are working on International Year of the Woman Farmer programming. And we're just thrilled to be here. And our role as Annie's Project for over 20 years is really trying to help women be more successful through education, networking, and resources. And we continue to do that with this programming and with all of the other work that we do throughout the year and every year. But Annie's Project welcomes all people to participate in our program. So however you come to us, you're welcome to be part of what we do, woman or not. Just some things as far as International Year of the Woman Farmer programming in the United States. As I said, we're working with organizations across the country. Starting off next week, there will be a kickoff reception in Washington, D.C., led by the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. This will be held during their winter meeting, but they are inviting a broader coalition of agricultural folks together to be at that reception, and we will be at that reception next week. Later in the month of February, we will have another feature like this. Watch our website and social media for the things that we'll be offering throughout the year. Also wanted to alert you to the fact that there will be an International Year of the Woman Farmer ACE Summit that is being led by Farm Bureau in Washington, D.C. on June 1st through 3rd. And Annie's Project is heading up an International Year of the Woman Farmer virtual conference, and those will be partial days on December 8th and 9th. If you'd like to find out more about Annie's Project or programming that we're doing for International Year of the Woman Farmer, you can follow the QR code or go to our website on anniesproject.org. Also wanted to mention that in this International Year of the Woman Farmer, Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau is heading up a national women in agriculture study. You can go to our website and we have a link there, or you can head directly over to American Farm Bureau Federation and take the survey right there. So with that, we will turn things over to our illustrious speakers. We have Colette DePhelps here with us today from the University of Idaho Extension, and also Katie Dentzman from Iowa State University. And Colette's going first. She will be speaking, and then she will go right into Katherine's presentation. And after the presentations are done, then we will host a Q&A session at the very end. So while we're going along, feel free to put your questions in chat and comments as we go along, and we will address those at the end. So welcome, Colette and Katie.
Thank you, Doris. I'm really pleased to be here talking to you all today about some of the work that we've done to really understand more about women farmers and ranchers in the U.S. and in my state of Idaho. I'm Colette DePhelps. I'm an area extension educator, and I'm in the northern part of the Idaho Panhandle, located on the Moscow campus. My focus is supporting community food systems and small farms. And when I started working with our University of Idaho research team back in 2018 to support women farmers were identified as socially disadvantaged by USDA. And so today I really want to talk to you about some of our initial work that we did looking at women farmers and what we could know from the Census of Ag, and then to talk a little bit about how women farmer trends are reported. Then I'll be handing over the slides to Katie, who's going to delve into the Census of Ag for 2017 and then some changes in 2022 to help us understand more about women farmers and ranchers across the U.S. And then we'll have time for questions and discussions. As Doris said, please go ahead and put those questions into the chat as we go along. So the first grant that we had was established in 2019, and this was a USDA Research and Extension grant. And as I said, at the time that this grant was funded, women farmers were designated as socially disadvantaged, and there was very little quantitative research on women farmers. So we had some qualitative research. It mostly focused on women farmers that were in direct markets. But what we saw is that women farmers were often identified as struggling financially, and there was an overall impression that women farmers had less access to resources, including land. So we really wanted to delve into understanding more about women farmers and understanding what is the financial performance of women farms, what resources are available to them, and what are their goals? How can we make a difference in their farm operations and, of course, in their lives and the lives of their families and communities? So at idahowomeninag.org, you will find 9 publications, 21 fact sheets, 2 webinars, and 3 podcasts that share our research results. I'm going to share just a couple of highlights with you, but I really encourage you to go to our website and delve into all the different facets of what we've learned about women farmers and ranchers in the U.S. So one of the really striking things that we learned in this first project is that when we look at U.S. Census data showing farms with a positive net income and a non-retired primary producer whose main occupation was farming, that for every dollar a woman-operated farm made, a male-operated farm made $2.50, which really identified this huge gender gap in net farm income, 151%. Showing that farm operation is one of the most gender unequal occupations in the U.S. And delving into why that is, we saw that it was really the endowments, it was the resources, the value of the land and the buildings, the value of machinery and equipment, that held 80% of the reasons for this gap in income. And we know that a lot of these gaps exist because we have a largely patriarchal farming culture in the United States. And there's been some structural inequities in terms of being able to pass land and cultural challenges in passing land and equipment down to women to be able to operate that next farming generation. So land access has been a challenge for women. And we see that in the performance of farms. We also asked Idaho women farmers and ranchers for some of their experience. And so we did a survey in the end of 2020, so the end of the pandemic year, and the beginning of 2021, and we had 464 full responses to our Idaho Women Farmer and Rancher survey. And as you can see, the majority of the respondents had less than $50,000 in net farm income. Actually, almost 70% had less than 15,000. But what was really striking is that when we asked about income and the role of the farm within the whole family income structure, we found that 41% of our respondents said it was very important to them to have their farm or ranch be a primary source of income for their family. And for 38%, it was important to have it be a secondary source of income. We also saw that by and large, women farmers and ranchers wanted to expand their operations. So when we asked, do you plan to expand in the next 5 years, 30% said yes, 21% said no, but 49% said maybe, and that it depended on access to land and resources to be able to do that. So taking this body of information that we learned, we submitted a second proposal to USDA, which was funded, to really look at how could we increase the profitability of women-operated farms and ranchers in the US and in Idaho. And how does enterprise diversification play into our understanding of how farms can be more profitable? And so to do this, we were really wanting to look at trends between the 2017 census and the 2022 census, and to delve into understanding how meeting financial goals impacts such important processes on the farm, such as farm succession. Unfortunately, our grant was terminated because it was identified as a DEI initiative, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the quote we were given, specifically, the objectives of the award were designed to benefit individuals primarily based on sex. I would say that because we know the majority of women farmers are operating farms with their male partners, and we're going to see that in our next presentation, I think that, emphasizing women farmers is to the benefit of U.S. agriculture. So while we were not able to complete our second project, we did learn a lot that we're putting into practice and wanting to share with you about how you best can support women farmers and ranchers. So just a couple examples of how we see the trends reported about women farmers and ranchers. AI tells us that women farmers are a rapidly growing segment in U.S. agriculture. Yes, 30% of all producers. This is definitely 2022 Census of Ag data. It also says that the overall number of farmers has declined while the number of women in agricultural decision-making roles has increased. Back in 2016, there was in a very popular ag press article that talked about women growing actually tripling over the past 30 years. So saying, according to this particular article in 1986, that maybe we had about 10% of our women farm operators were farmers. Sorry, I just kind of messed that up. About 10% of the women farmers and ranchers okay, I'm just going to totally start over. So this particular article is alluding to in 1986 that we have about 10% of our total farmers in the United States being women, and that had tripled over the last 3 decades. And then a more recent article is saying that we really were about 30% of our women farmers in 2007, and that increased all the way up to 36% in 2022. And we can see this graph here that is also supporting this information where looking at census data, the number of male farmers is declined slightly, the number of women farmers has increased, and the share of women farmers from 2002 to 2022 has increased greatly. So with that kind of overview of our research project, some of our key learnings, I'm going to go ahead and hand the slides over to Katie to talk more in depth about what we know from the Census of Ag.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I really enjoy talking about the Census of Agriculture. I'm Dr. Katie Dentzman, an assistant professor of rural sociology from Iowa State University. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the U.S. Census of Agriculture. That's something I've been studying for a while now, working with Colette and some other folks, and looking into what it can reasonably tell us about women farmers in the U.S. So again, this is a quantitative data source. This is us not really going out and talking to women farmers, but using what we have as far as the most comprehensive quantitative counting of women farmers in order to figure out what some of the general trends and generalizable trends are that women are experiencing in agriculture. So a little bit more on the Census of Agriculture. It's the most representative source of demographic data on US farmers. So it's a really, really powerful source of data. And it's conducted once every 5 years, which you might be familiar with if you've gotten the request to fill it out. It's also sent to every farm that averages at least $1,000 in farm-related income per year. So it's really trying to capture a lot of different kinds of farming enterprises. And it's used to make a lot of different decisions on various policies and programs and targeting the specific needs of different groups. So as far as what demographics the Census of Agriculture looks at, they started collecting information on individual farmers in 1974. So looking at things like, for instance, the gender of farmers. And so they started identifying a single principal farmer per farm. So at this point, we would have understood women's farms to be those with a single listed woman producer. You could only choose one person to list on the form. So you would get the Census of Agriculture, and they would say, who is the principal farmer on your farm? You would note who that person is and fill out some information about them. How old are they? How long have they been in farming? Their gender, these kinds of things. And so that's how we really understood women's farms at that point in time. In 2002, however, the Census of Agriculture started allowing up to 3 producers to be listed per farm. And obviously, this is going to change the way that we understand demographics in farming in the US. We also had respondents identify one as the principal. And so this was to have some consistency with previous census years. So we're still identifying one person as the main person on the farm, but we're also kind of starting to acknowledge, yeah, there's other people on the farm who are reasonably making decisions and influencing how the farm is run and the future of the farm. And we want to acknowledge that those people are also farm producers. So at this point, usually researchers would define women's farms as those with a woman farmer identified as the single principal farmer out of the 3. So that makes it a little more comparable to previous years. So we can try and track, okay, was the main farmer on this farm a woman? In 2017, they started allowing 4 producers listed per farm, so added one more, and researchers started identifying who was the primary. Now, as we will see, this was pretty hard to do and ended up with a lot of variation and a bit of confusion as well. But at this point, women's farms would be those with a woman farmer identified as the single primary farmer out of the potential 4 listed. So to visualize this a little and to kind of give you another go at it, from 1974 to 1997, we had 1 producer listed, right? You could only list one person. That's the person who is the farmer. From 2002 to 2012, you could have up to 3 producers listed, and you designated one as the principal in charge of farm decisions. At this point, we saw a major increase in the number of women farmers being reported in the Census of Agriculture because we often saw a woman who was on the farm as a farming spouse suddenly being added. So she had always existed on the farm, but not previously been counted. So we saw this really big jump in the number of women farmers that were being accurately counted at this time. In 2017, we added a 4th producer category, and we also saw the number of women farmers jump pretty substantially at that point, as Colette alluded to, not necessarily because there were more women in farming, but because we're counting them better, right? Often that 4th person, who is more often a woman, was already there, but now we're counting her more effectively. We also started allowing respondents to choose up to 4 as principals. So each farmer could or could not be designated a principal farmer, and researchers were left to identify who is the primary farmer on the farm, which got pretty complicated pretty fast. So while I was working as a postdoc at University of Idaho, I asked USDA NAS, how are we identifying this one person who we consider most in charge of on-farm decision making? And so they told me that they use this process that I will show you here. It's fairly long and complicated, and they eventually got rid of this because it was too long and complicated, and they decided it really wasn't that useful or accurate. But basically, if only one farmer was listed as the principal farmer, then we coded that person as the primary farmer. If more than one farmer on the questionnaire was listed as the principal, then we started looking at on-farm decision making. Is there one person on the farm who's making more on-farm decisions than the others? If so, they're the primary farmer. If everyone shares it, then we look at who works fewer days off farm. If they work the same number of days, then the USDA recommended that we randomly choose one of the principal farmers to code as the primary. Our research team instead decided to choose whoever was listed first. So we thought that that made more sense kind of logically, that the main farmer would be whoever you listed first. And as we'll see, that created some significant differences in who we identify as the primary farmer. Okay, so a couple stats on the 2017 Census of Agriculture counts of women farmers. As previously stated, women are about 36% of all farmers. So if you're looking at everybody, you're not considering principal, you're not considering primary, women are about 36%, right? If you're looking at principal farmers, and again, this is self-designated, where every single farmer listed, you could check yes or no, this person is a principal farmer. Women are slightly down to 29%. If you use the USDA coding, that chart that I showed you, that flow chart, then women are about 24% of primary farmers. And if you use our coding, where you didn't use the random decision at the bottom and you just assigned it to whoever was first, women are down to 19%. So you can immediately see that how you count and how you define farmers and how you think about decision making on farms really impacts who we think about as farmers. So you could say women are 36% of farmers, but maybe they're 19% of farmers who are mostly in charge of the farm. Is that data accurate? What's going on there? We'll dig into that in just a minute. But how we count farmers has changed, and how we count women farmers has changed pretty significantly and has changed the picture of women in farming that we have. So a little bit of a graph to show growth over time. And this is hard to track because of changes in how women farmers have been counted. Again, we started out counting one person, and then we started counting 3 people, and then we started counting 4 people. So it's hard to track over time. But if you compare the number of men to women principal operators from 1997 to 2017, the blue line is men, the orange line is women. You can see that the number of men operators kind of increased a little, and then in recent census years has actually been on the decline, whereas women farmers have been increasing over time. Now, that could be because of how we've been counting them, but it still is really interesting to see that trend. There's also another way that we can try and track the number of women farmers and how it's changed over time to try and control for some of that data confusion. And that's to look at the percent of women who are listed first over time. Because presumably you're always going to list the first person first, right? And so the number of women who are listed as farmer number 1 in the census has really gone up quite a bit since the 1920s when we first have any kind of data on this. That was about 4% of women listed as farmer number 1 on the farm. And then in 2017, that got up all the way to about 15%. So a pretty significant growth, and that's pretty interesting. And one of the ways that we try and estimate the growth of women farmers over time, given that the data has changed so much in how we collect it. So a little note on position on farm as well, because this is really interesting. And like I said, you can list up to 4 farmers per farm. You can list somebody as farmer 1, farmer 2, farmer 3, and farmer 4. And it's really interesting to look at how men and women were divided between those positions. So farmer number 1, the first person listed in the 2017 Census of Agriculture, like I said, 15% women. Farmer number 2, 74% women. Super interesting. So people tend to list a man first, and they tend to list a woman second. The assumption here is probably that they are married, right? And so they're a married couple in farming, it's a man and a woman. The person listed, oh, actually, before I go on to that, another really interesting fact here is that these two farmers listed first and second are all making all kinds of farming decisions. They're involved in everything. Doesn't matter if you're listed first, doesn't matter if you're listed second, you are making farm, land use, livestock, estate planning, and record keeping decisions. Women making them at the same rate as men if they're in that farmer one or farmer two position. So whether you're listed first or second, you are 100% involved in all of the decisions according to this data. Farmer number 3, 40% were women, and farmer number 4, 57% were women. So that's really interesting as well. It's a little bit less of a difference, so maybe a little more equity in the listing lower down. But additionally, these people, when they're listed third and fourth, the women tend to be making fewer farm, land use, and livestock decisions and more estate planning and record keeping decisions. So we're wondering, but we don't know for sure, if these are women who are maybe like grandparents or involved in the farm in slightly different ways. So you have the two farmers listed first, usually a man and a woman, who are very involved in every decision. And then you have farmer 3 and 4, who are maybe more involved in estate planning and record keeping decisions. It's also interesting to note that if there's a woman who's listed first as farmer number 1, there are more women overall on the farm. So it seems like women in charge of farms tend to hire more women. Okay, a little note on farm resources as well. And I see a couple of questions coming in. We decided to take questions at the end, so we will get to addressing those. Thank you so much for asking them as we go along. But one of the things that our team really wanted to do as well is look at women's representation on farms, but not just their representation. We also wanted to look at what kind of farm resources they have. And so this is looking at women versus men who were coded as the primary farmer in the 2017 Census of Agriculture. And so what we found was that farms that had been coded to be run by men were on average 488 acres in size, whereas women's farms were 228 acres. So they tended to be fairly small and much smaller than men's. Part of that is a reflection of the kinds of crops that they decided to grow, but there's other factors at play there as well. Men's farms tended to have a greater proportion of their land rented, whereas women's tended to have a greater proportion owned. The value of farmland and buildings, as Colette said, for men's farms was very high. For women, it was about half of that. And the value of farm machinery, pretty similar. It was also really interesting to me to look at the organic trend, because if we're looking at farms run by men, about 1.4% were organic, and of those, 71% were certified. There's kind of this stereotype in a lot of the greater literature on women farmers that women are organic farmers. And we did find that women were more likely to be farming organic than men, but not by a ton. It was 2% of all women-run farms in the Census of Agriculture that were organic, which means it was 98% that were not, which is a pretty interesting statistic. Also, 41% were certified. So although they were farming organically at a greater rate than men, they were certified at a lower rate. Part of that could be because they're exempt, right? A lot more people were exempt because of farm size. But there's probably some other stuff going on there too that I can talk about at more length if you're interested in it. Another thing that we were interested in was looking at farm scale. And so as Colette said, a lot of the difference between farm income for men and women can actually be explained by farm scale. And so we wanted to know, what is the distribution of women across different farm scales? And so we have here the different 7 farm scales. So farm scales 1, 2, and 3 are farms that are making under $350,000. So there's a little bit of nuance in there, but that's kind of the benchmark for smaller farms. And so you can see in the chart that about 20% of all farms making under $350,000 are run by women. The middle scale, 4 and 5, you see a real drop in the percent run by women farmers. Those tend to be corn and soybean farms and field crop farms. And so we see a much lower percentage of women running those farms. However, in the 1 million plus category, we see women kind of jump back up, where we also have a significant proportion of these very large scale, very large income farms that are being run by women. Really interesting to see that. And if you look at the kinds of products they're producing, Men on these very large scale farms more often are producing things like corn and soybeans. Women on these large scale farms are more often involved in animal agriculture. So they're maybe reaching this same level, this same farm scale, but through different strategies, which is really informative. We're also interested in looking at productivity, like I said, by scale. And there's been quite a bit of research looking at, okay, maybe women aren't making as much farm income as men. Does that have to do with how large their farms are? And so we investigated this looking at a couple different commodities and their sales. So if we look at field crop sales and we look at the average income for men and women, men on average in the Census of Ag were making $240,000 in field crop sales, and women were making 111,000, right? So it looks like women are not doing as well in field crop sales. But if we start to look at field crop sales per acre in order to account for the farm size, that difference almost disappears. Where per acre, men are making $291 and women are making $251. So you see per acre, they're much more similar, which basically just means that men's farms are bigger, and that's why they're making more sales. Same kind of trend in vegetable sales. We see that men have an average of $300,000 in vegetable sales per year, women just about 66,000. Seems like a massive difference. When we get down to per acre, it's almost exactly the same, and women are making actually slightly more. So again, women are doing really well on the size farms that they have, but since their farms tend to be smaller, it may appear like they're not making as much in sales. We see a similar trend with equines. Women tend to be making less in general, but per acre, we actually see that women are making quite a bit more. So really interesting trends. And we have a couple publications on this that you are more than welcome to look up. I'll share my contact information at the end of this presentation. And you can search my last name on Google Scholar, or you can email me, and I'm happy to send any of the articles that I'm an author on to you if you're interested in that. So we also wanted to kind of continue this research on women farmers and look at it in terms of the 2022 Census of Agriculture. However, when we went to look at this, USDA NASS informed us that they're not going to be using the principal and primary farmer variables anymore to identify women farmers. And this was kind of a shock because obviously it's been since like 1974 that we've been identifying one person per farm who's in charge. And that's how we've been measuring women's farms. But many of the primary farmers in the 2017 census were chosen at random. You know, that flowchart that I showed you, where if they're all the same, they get chosen at random. 25% of people were designated a primary farmer at random with the USDA's coding, which is a ton. And so it's like, maybe that's not really effective. And also they convened an expert panel that recommended using a proportional or percentage variable to better account for shared decision-making structures. For saying, okay, wait a minute, reasonably, is it just one person on the farm who's making decisions? Isn't it really about collective decision making in a lot more cases? And so this was intended to account better for the fact that it's usually not just one person who's really in control of the entire farm. The issue that we ran into this we ran into as researchers is that there's a lot of possible different ways to count the percentage or proportion of women on a farm. So I came up with 8, and there's probably more, but I came up with 8. As far as binary variables, so that's just a yes or no variable. If you look at all the producers on the farm, you could look at farms that have any women versus only men. You could also look at farms that have only women versus any men. You could do the same for just farmers who make day-to-day decisions. So we've got a couple different ways of comparing, okay, this farm has any women versus it has no women, it has only men. Or this farm has only women versus the farm has at least some men on it. You could also do a continuous variable, so that's just the proportion or the percent of women on a farm. And you could do that for all producers or only for day-to-day decision makers. And then I also had some options for larger categorical variables. So you could look at farms that have only men, mixed gender, or only women. And so kind of combining a couple of the different strategies. And again, you could do that for all producers or day-to-day decision makers. So let's look at maybe some of the stats, and that'll help us understand these different options a little more effectively. If you're looking at farms that have any women, 56% of farms in the US have at least one woman farmer on them, right? And 44% have only men. That's interesting. That's informative. If you look at farms that have any men, it's 91% versus farms that are only women is 9%. And so depending on how you choose to represent the proportion of women on a farm, you can tell very, very different stories about women involved in farming, right? And so part of the concern is that people might cherry pick some of these different statistics in order to tell the story that they want to tell. So we looked at a couple different options for how to represent women on farms proportionally. We also just looked at straight percentages. And so 0% here is farms that had 0% women. So they were all men, right? And that's 44%. Interestingly, the 25% women, 33% women, 66 and 75, very, very low. Very few farms that had that. There were quite a few farms that were 50-50, right? That had half women and half men. That was just over 40%. And then as far as 100%, so farms that were entirely women run, that was around 9%. So 0, 50, and 100 are really the categories that we're working with here. So we thought, okay, why not condense that into just a variable that has three categories? It has farms that have only men, which is 38%, farms that have only women, 9%, and farms that are mixed gender, 53%. Okay, that seems to capture a lot of what our other variables capture without being quite so confusing or quite so binary. And I do think that this might be the way that we start to look at women in farming going forward in the Census of Agriculture. And I'll show you why, because I think it captures a lot more interesting variation and nuance than our other variables. So my example is vegetable production, looking at what farms are more likely to produce vegetables. Does it matter if a woman is on the farm? Does it matter if a man is on the farm? And so for the binary variables, we see statistically that farms with any women are more likely to produce vegetables than farms with only men. So if you have a farm with only a man, you add a woman to the farm, that farm is more likely to produce vegetables. However, if you use the variable any men, only women, farms with any men are more likely to produce vegetables than farms with only women. That seems to be kind of the opposite, right? Like, that doesn't make sense. We have one variable that's saying, okay, add a woman to the farm, you're more likely to produce vegetables. We have one variable saying, add any men to the farm, you're more likely to produce vegetables. What's going on here? If we use the proportional variable, we see that the chance of producing vegetables increases as the proportion of women on the farm increases. So that aligns with that first finding that it's like, okay, it's women on the farm driving vegetable production. But there's so much variation there, like what's really going on? When we use that three category variable, we get our answer. And it's that mixed gender farms are actually more likely to produce vegetables. So you can see that farms with only men and farms with only women were both slightly less likely to produce vegetables than farms with both men and women on them. And so this is why I like this three category variable, because it shows us more nuance and really like introduces that mixed gender variable that might be really important in some cases. And if we leave it out or leave out some of the other categories, we might draw the wrong conclusions about men and women's farms. So a couple concluding thoughts for us, and then we'll get into some questions. So it seems like from all of our different, slightly imperfect but improving data sources, that women are seeing some increases in representation on farms and especially in decision making on farms. They tend to have fewer resources in terms of things like land and machinery, but they're also similarly productive per acre using the resources that they do have in things like vegetables and field crops. I also suggest a categorical variable for measuring the proportion of women farmers. It might not be right for all research questions, but it does seem to give us the broadest understanding and hopefully the least confusion. And the variability in how women are counted introduces some really important nuance to the Census of Agriculture, but there's also a bit of confusion and some potential for massaging the data to match your desired message. So data does drive visibility and interpretation of what's going on farms, right? Qualitative research actually going out and talking to women, extraordinarily important because it tells us the real stories behind why these things are happening. But data does drive a lot of different policy and political decisions. It can also influence social acceptance and formal and informal sources of support. So really my point for a lot of this is that data accessibility needs improvement and that the interpretations of the Census of Ag are increasingly requiring some complexity and some nuance. So we need a bit more clarity and data literacy, and I hope that some of my work can help improve that. So if you're interested in learning more, this is me. You can go to my faculty site, you can go to my LinkedIn. I have my email and my phone number there. Probably the most reliable way to get in contact with me is through email. And like I said, I have multiple publications that outline a lot more details on this, including how the Census of Agriculture works, how you can access that data, a lot more details on women's farms and how they're counted. Sometimes those articles are behind paywalls. If you email me directly, I can send you them for free. So definitely feel free to reach out if you find an article that you want to read and are having trouble accessing it. So I think we're going to open it up to questions now. Doris, I don't know if you want to handle that or if you want us to field the questions.
Whatever you're more comfortable with. So we're happy to do it either way. So, okay. So we've had some thank yous and stuff. There was actually quite a lot of conversations that were happening here. So maybe let's see, start from the beginning here. Try to address some of this. So apologies that so early on, we did have a person that commented, "Are you for real right now? The patriarch. How many total women farmers did you speak with? Are you a farmer who writes your paycheck?" Um, and then we had another person. Let me just read a few because there was some conversations that went on to help you understand. I think it's important for you to know your audience. I'm just starting out and I'm already aggravated at the pronouns and the patriarch comment. You're about to lose me here and probably others. I want to learn something and not be indoctrinated. Okay, so we'll move on. Then another person commented, I think the use of the word patriarchy was referring to historical ways in which men's labor was unfairly valued differently than women's labor. They are just mentioned that women were only counted as farm spouse and not primary farmer. They use the term patriarchy correctly within the definition of the word, not to indoctrinate anyone. I just wanted you to hear all of that because there was some unfolding as we went on. So I don't know if you have a comment. If those really weren't questions, but if you had any response there, you're welcome to provide that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your comments. So I think part of what we're talking about when we're talking about a patriarchal society and what Colette was referring to, and Colette, correct me if I'm wrong, is basically that the way our society is structured is to pass land and farm operations down between men and sons, right? And so, like a matriarchal society would be a society in which land and inheritance is passed from women to daughters. We live in a society where typically things are passed down between men and sons, or at least historically have been. So there used to be actually laws about this as well, laws that no longer exist, which is also part of why we might see more women in farming. But it's really just speaking to like the structure of society and the patterns of why we might see less land passed down to daughters historically. And then because that was a historical trend, we kind of have that understanding currently in our society. So it's just a way to understand one of the historical reasons that women might be owning less land than men. So Colette, correct me if that was the incorrect interpretation of what you were saying.
Absolutely, that was the correct. And really looking at the holdings, the value of the land and the machinery, the holdings that men have versus women, that could partially be explained by how land was passed and the equipment for farming operations through generations. And I see we have a comment that historically, yes, but I don't necessarily find that now in the West. And I would agree, we're seeing changes and trends. And one of the trends that we're also seeing outside of land transfer is that within College of Agriculture programs across the nation, we're seeing that we're finding more women in those programs than men. So we're really seeing some changing leadership, I would say, or very visible leadership within agriculture in all sectors right now with women. And I'm not saying that leadership was not always there. What I'm saying is the visibility of the leadership is changing.
Yeah, and patterns of land inheritance are changing. I have some colleagues in economics here at Iowa State that are investigating that, and it's really fascinating to see that often a lot more land is being passed down to daughters as well. And also, like another person said, that there's the reality of women, then there's the statistics, and that is absolutely true. And our study is really just concentrating on the statistics, but there's also a ton of great research out there that is more qualitative in nature, which basically means people actually go and talk face to face with women farmers. Um, I absolutely love all of that research, and I think it's a really nice complement to the kind of research that we do. We're definitely not trying to speak for women farmers. That's not the goal, but this data is also really hard to access. And like I said, how it is used, it's used in creating like the Farm Bill. It's used in creating a lot of really important legislation. And so it's important to understand, how is this data interpreted? How is it understood? Because whether or not it should be, it's used to make a lot of policy decisions. So there's maybe a conversation there to be had around how policy decisions are made and how this data versus other data is used for those things.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Somebody was, well, we have lots of different questions and comments, but curious what number you recommend using when estimating women farmers. You presented a few from different data sets.
Yeah, and that is a question that, believe me, is ongoing and that a lot of researchers are contending with. A lot of the data that I presented is using the identifying one primary woman per farm, because when I was collecting that research, that was the official recommendation. That has changed, and now the recommendation is to look at proportions. So going forward, I'm probably going to use that only men, mixed gender, only women categorization in my own research.
Okay. So that's something for people to watch for as they're reading things. How are people presenting, and which classifications they're using, because they tell
Yeah.
different stories in some cases.
They really do. And I feel like sometimes people aren't clear enough about how they're using the data and what kind of definitions they're using. And that can introduce a lot of confusion, unfortunately.
Sure. Somebody conjectured it earlier on, talking about, maybe I think it's related to the increase in women farmers. It is because of the possibility of woman-owned status have seen a shift in all business across the board, because there have been some finance opportunities that were available only to women-owned businesses. Is that
Mm.
maybe why, we've seen a bit of that shift?
That's a good question. And I'd be interested to see more data on that. The data through the USDA Census of Agriculture, it does ask about loans a little bit, but it doesn't ask really about specific loans, or if you access them through like the socially disadvantaged farmers program or anything like that. So I think that would probably be a different data source that we'd have to look at to determine kind of what's going on there.
And somebody made the comment, if it was my family farm, I'd be and more likely to get a grant. Of course, I'd move the woman to number one. So there we go. But there was some other discourse there, but I'll get back to asking the questions. Let's see, somebody said, I've already said there are statistics and I respect statistics, and then there is the reality that women are half of the US farm population. Fascinating data. And then someone was asking too about the representation of diversity within the data set,
Mhm.
beyond gender. Can you comment on that? And have you been doing any research on minority women?
Yeah, absolutely. That was part of our initial grant, actually, was to look at how women farmers differ by different categories, because a lot of research has treated women farmers as kind of this monolith, and they're not, right? There's young beginning women farmers, and there's older, more experienced women farmers. There's women farming alone. There's women farming with partners. There's women who have veteran status, right? And there's women who are minorities. And so we're really interested in looking at a lot more diversity among women farmers. And what we found was pretty interesting as far as looking at, say, like minority women farmers. There's a lot of variation in where they are. There's a lot of variation in what they farm, how much land they have, and how successful they are financially. So a great example is that like Native American women farmers are doing great in terms of land. On average, they have way more acreage than white women farmers. And mostly they tend to be farming sheep, really interesting, especially in Arizona, but they're not making a lot of money doing it, right? This seems to be more of like almost a cultural practice. In contrast, Asian American women farmers are actually doing really, really well financially. They're mostly along the West Coast. They're often farming organic vegetables, usually on pretty small plots of land, but they're making decent money doing it. And so there's really quite a bit of variation when we start to look at things like race and ethnicity as well, for sure.
Can I ask how you plan to continue this important research when federal funding does not currently support gender research?
Yeah, so there's a variety of ways to start looking at farms. And I think actually the way that the Census of Agriculture has started recommending looking at women's farms aligns with a lot of that. Because it's not just looking at women, it's looking at women and men's farms and how women and men combine and work together to be successful in farming and what kind of different strengths and resources they both bring to farms. And so I think that's definitely one way to frame it. And then there's also, so data accessibility becomes kind of another conversation here, right? So the way that you access Census of Agriculture data, there is free access to the Census of Agriculture data, but somewhat a limited sample, like limited questions. You don't get every question. You can't do a lot of complex statistics with it. But like if you go to the USDA Census of Ag website, you can find statistics. So you don't necessarily need funding to do that part of it. What you tend to need funding for is getting access to all of the data, right? And that is a fee that you pay to a data enclave that helps you to access the data remotely. That's I think $3,000 for like a year or two of access. So that is possible to do with other kinds of funding sources. But yeah, it is a little bit up in the air right now.
Okay, let's see. Colette has put in the chat the link to getting access to research papers. Would those include all of the papers that Katie worked on? So Katie
Related
doesn't have
to
to.
these two particular USDA research projects, yes.
Okay.
All of Katie's papers, no, but definitely related to
Well,
the.
I was just wondering if this alleviates Katie having to send out individual papers. If everyone goes to that link, will they find the things related to this talk there? Okay.
Yeah. If you want any of my papers on neonicotinoid resistance, you're going to have to go somewhere else. But yeah, all the women farmers papers should be there.
Okay, marvelous. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for making those available for free so people can review your research. So nice job, gals. I'm glad you mentioned the qualitative data collection method. I would also be interested to see how the data align with federal program funds received
Mm.
by women through USDA NRCS, for example.
Absolutely. So we did look at the variables in the Census of Ag that deal with like federal programs and federal funding. And unfortunately, the questions aren't super detailed, but they do ask in general, have you received funding from like a government program, a federal program within the last year? And if so, how much? And we found that farms that were run by women as the primary farmer were less likely to have received government payments on their farms and to have received less of that money. However, there was an exception, which was for conservation payments. So they ask a separate question about specific conservation payments. And women were actually more likely to have received conservation payments than men. So generally, federal payments and support, women were receiving less, but they were outpacing men in terms of payments for conservation. So things like NRCS. Yep.
And in our Idaho Women Farmers and Ranchers survey, we asked about accessing different kinds of USDA resources. And what we found is that the biggest barrier was that the respondents to our survey didn't know that they existed. So for extension, that told us that we needed to do more programs and outreach to help connect producers with those resources that could serve their farms.
Interesting. So, one of the things that strikes me is that, as the census went to asking more specific questions about the roles that you play on the farm, from Annie's project being educational in nature and wanting to help people uh, become, more able to manage risk, manage farming operations, agricultural operations. When you look at things where women don't seem to be the decision makers or as involved in things, one of the things that strikes me is that perhaps it's because they might not have had the exposure to some of those areas, and that if they were exposed, had some educational programming, had some opportunities to do some additional learning in those areas, we might see their involvement increase in the operations. That was just one thing that struck me as I'm looking at numbers and looking at how to, see where maybe women could get more involved because their confidence increases and their knowledge in those areas potentially increase. I don't know if that's something that really, or if people are involved in operations and they've aligned themselves as to who's got the better skill set, or maybe some of it's by default too. Nobody's really great at certain things, and you end up getting to do this because somebody has to do it.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead, Colette.
Well, Doris, thinking about how we offer educational programming and making sure that people have access, I think that makes a lot of difference. And so oftentimes, at least in Idaho, we've seen that if people have children or responsibilities on the farm where both farm operators cannot leave, they have to choose.
Right.
And so, how can we create opportunities for education that allow multiple farm operators to attend? And I think one of the things that we're doing is that we are really leaning into online education opportunities, especially we are a very rural state. It's expensive to travel to educational programming. So I think some of the technology that we now have can help people develop the skills and knowledge that they've been seeking to improve whatever operations they're looking at on their farm or ranch.
Great.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
do know that here at at Iowa State, we have a extension Women in Ag program, and I have a little bit of knowledge about what they do as well. And there's really interesting reporting that basically women who attend their training sessions on conservation programs like the NRCS, and so to Colette's point, are made aware that these programs exist, are much more likely to go out and apply for that funding and to get that funding. So it does seem like awareness is an issue, but when women are made aware of these programs, they're fairly successful in going out and successfully securing that funding.
Well, and Annie's project has been very proud to partner with Iowa State and Idaho as well, and states across the country to help deliver that education and those opportunities to learn more. And we're right there with you on the expanding the online availability so people can come as they are and meet us, and we meet them where they're at, because travel can be a huge barrier for people, and just that getting away from the operation and children and whatever other responsibilities. So, all right. Other questions or comments, folks? Thank you for the comment about one of the best webinars you've attended in the last year. So kudos to both of you ladies. Terrific job. Great information shared today. And really appreciate you helping us kick off the International Year of the Woman Farmer. Any last words that you'd like to share with the folks that are gathered?
Just thank you for being here and thank you for being part of the conversation. I love seeing people's reaction to all of the data. Sometimes I can get a little into the numbers, and it's great to really get that out to a larger perspective of women farmers and their advocates. And yeah, I just appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. We will be posting this on Annie's Project YouTube channel, so you can look for the recording there, and if you'd like to share it with other folks, we encourage you to do so. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.